Good evening, all. I hope and trust that you can all hear me. My name is Angie Irwin, and I'm pleased to be presenting to you this evening our board webinar for those boards that have been appointed by Lake Superior State University, Interpreting Assessment Data, What You Need to Know and Why. This webinar is the first of a few more to come throughout the 2013-2014 school year, and Nick Olszewski is going to talk a little bit about that toward the end of our session this evening. I'll be co-facilitating tonight's session with one of my colleagues, Mark Weinberg. Before we begin the session, however, I'd like to offer a couple of housekeeping comments. First, this session is being recorded and will be made available to you on Lake Superior State University's website in the near future. And then secondly, to maximize audio clarity, participants will be muted throughout the session. I would ask, however, that as you have questions, you either use the raise hand icon appearing on your screen. This will appear next to your name on my screen, or ask questions in the questions pane that should also be appearing on your screen. I will monitor this activity throughout the session while Mark Weinberg is doing most of the talking. And as you have questions through your raise hand icon or through your questions that I'll be monitoring in the questions pane, I will just interrupt Mark, unmute you, so you can ask those questions accordingly. Before we begin, I'll ask Nick if he has any comments to share. So I'm going to unmute him and he can say a few words of introduction and welcome to you also.
Thank you, Angie. I'd like to welcome all of our participants to the first of 5 webinars that we're going to be offering this year to our boards. And the first one, the interpreting assessment data, is an important topic because it'll help the board members better understand the educational goals that are set in their charter contracts. If you haven't had an opportunity to read your contract, I would suggest that you go through it and especially look at the educational goals. If you don't have a copy of the contract, you can find it on the Lake Superior State University Charter School Office website. We have all the contracts for all of our charters listed there. And as Angie had indicated, we'll have the webinars listed on that website also. Before we begin, I'd like to thank Angie and Mark for being presenters. And Mark, I talked to Angie a little bit about your computer problems. I just think you need to trade in your Commodore and get something a little bit more updated. So you can continue. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nick, for those comments. Okay, great, all. Now I'm going to
go ahead. And thank you for that, Nick.
Go ahead, Mark. I was just going to say I'm passing the proverbial torch to you now so you can take over the presentation.
All right. Well, thank you. Good evening, board members. And I do know that you are the volunteers on this call, and Nick, Angie, and I all appreciate the hours you put into being volunteer board members for the charter schools you oversee. And we recognize that, that your time is valuable. I'll try and make it as meaningful as possible this evening. I want to reiterate what Nick said. Other than what he said about my technology, I'm sticking with the Commodore. It's a good, solid machine. But beyond that, your charter contract is what defines your relationship with Lake Superior State University. And I will try as often as possible this evening to reference back to your charter contract. And a lot of what I'm going to present this evening is in relation to the charter contract. The other part I really want to emphasize is that you as board members are not expected to be psychometricians or assessment experts. What we're trying to help tonight with, if you're not already an assessment expert, is to give you some tools that can help you ask really good questions of the people who work day in, day out in your school, primarily your school leadership teams. All right, with that said, you get to start out with a very short assessment, one question. Angie, if you'll go to the next slide.
Yep, I have, Mark.
So here's
It's
a pop
coming.
quiz for you. So the single most important question to ask before you look at assessment data is, and then I give you 4 choices, and this is the single most important question for you as a board member to ask, for an administrator, for a teacher, for a parent. Anybody administering tests to kids should always ask this question first. And let's see if we'll get a hand up, Angie. Is anybody willing to?
Not yet, but if you want to be brave and try to respond to this pop quiz, just as I mentioned, use your raise hand icon, and I will click on you and you can answer. Oh, we've got a hand. Liz, do you think you know the answer to this?
Okay. Well, I know my answer would be number C. Why did we give students this assessment?
Mm-hmm. Very good. Thank you. Mark, any thoughts on that? Mark, are you there?
You don't know what, if a teacher or an administrator doesn't know the answer to that question. I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Can you hear me, Angie?
Yes.
Okay. So yes, a teacher or an administrator should always know the answer to that question. The board members should, in essence, understand why an assessment was given and why they're looking at the results. And the best example is the one we all know best, which is the MEEP test. And often, unfortunately, the reason it was given is not well aligned to what the test is trying to test. So more often than not, we rank schools with using the MEEP test. We compare schools to one another, when actually the reason the MEEP test is given, you can go all the way back to the original founding of the test and when it was first given, was to see what students know and are able to do relative to the state standards. It was never designed, and it still isn't designed, to rank schools. Yet more often than not, that's why it's presented to you, and it's a great example of really thinking about why you give a student an assessment.
So,
And
Mark, is the right answer C?
Oh yes, absolutely. I'm
Good.
sorry. You must have. I must have said that when I was muted. But absolutely, the right answer is C. Always ask, why did we give students this assessment?
Good work, Liz. Thank you.
All right. So moving, keep that in mind at all times, no matter what the assessment data in front of you is, and make sure those talking about the assessment data have answered the question for themselves. So as we said earlier, our intention in providing this information to you tonight is so that you can ask wise questions. And what I've put in front of you, there are 6 areas in which we'll try and tackle this. What are the type of wise questions? And again, the first one is that essentially the purpose question. Why are you giving the assessment? What's the purpose of the assessment? And then the other questions we'll go through as well as we walk through our topic this evening. Again, we want you to gain a basic understanding of the science of tests. And that word on the right, psychometrics, is about the science of measurement, measuring human beings essentially, assessing students, is psychometrics. You're not going to be a psychometrician at the end of this presentation. I'm not a psychometrician. I know just enough, I think, to help you better understand the assessment data you look at when you have your board meetings. So that, and hopefully I'll be successful, and if I'm not, please fire away with questions at the end, or fire away with questions during the presentation, and certainly provide us feedback on how Nick and his team can better help you look at assessments and understand the assessments. So let's begin at the very beginning with the word assessment. And here's a definition. It's not the only definition, but I think it's a very good one. What it's stated in bold there, the process of observing learning. And that's very broad. That could mean a teacher sitting down beside an individual student and watching them as they learn. That's the most basic type of what we call formative assessment. But, describing, collecting, recording, scoring, and interpreting information about student learning, that then incorporates all the processes that we could talk about when we're observing student learning. tonight's presentation will focus on one type of assessment, primarily that being the summative assessment. That is really the assessment of student learning, what you do at the end of a period of student learning, potentially. And as a board member, primarily you're interested in that summative assessment at the school level. You want your teachers to be very, very familiar with the assessments at the most granular level, the item level and the student level. But you as board members will be primarily focused on school level results. And there you can see what we consider your role in assessment. Again, back to your charter contract, so ensuring academic achievement relative to the contractual goals, focusing on how well students are doing, and encouraging transparent, honest reporting from your school leadership. Moving right along to the next slide. All right, so a lot of people are interested in that summative school level assessment data, and your results are reported to the Michigan Department of Education in a number of ways, and it's generally your MEP test data. The media wants to know about your test data. You have to report to your parents. The legislators are interested in test data at the very top level, particularly in terms of charter schools. MAPSO wants to know about your test data for all the right reasons. And last, but most definitely not least, back to your authorizer. You have goals in your charter contract that your authorizer is held responsible for monitoring and holding you accountable to. So let's look at what it says in your charter contract on the next slide. This is actually in your contract, so I can let you read that for yourselves. But essentially, it's very clear that your authorizer expects you to make progress towards achieving the goals of the academy. It also states there, although I believe LSSU is very helpful in that it reports back to you rather than requiring a written report. But know that that is always there in your charter contract, that the charter schools office at LSSU at any time can ask for a written report along with supporting data. And that would be then your responsibility to provide that. But essentially, as you'll see later in this presentation, LSSU has tools that it can use to help with that and doesn't actually expect you to do the work in creating those reports. All right, carrying on.
Oh, good Lord. Oops, sorry. No, sorry, Mark.
That's
Let
okay.
me, yeah, I don't quite know what happened there. 1 too many clicks. There you go. 1 too many clicks. There you go.
That's all right. Gives me time to breathe.
Yep.
And if there's any questions, please raise those hands. If you haven't looked at your charter contract in a while, as Nick mentioned, always good to go back to it on a regular basis. Make sure you know what's in there and that you're working with your school leadership to ensure that they are collecting the data, analyzing the data, reporting the data in a way that is meaningful to you. So that's what you see here. Ideally, at your school board meetings, you see data or you see information rather than data. And I've got a couple of examples. Simple thumbs up, thumbs down, red X's, green checks, bar graphs. In general, what you want to do is make sure that you are getting simple school level data presented to you, and that you're also then, if there's a stakeholder out there that's interested, can also look at simple school level data. You don't want at the board level to get into the detail that you see on the right. That your teachers are already hopefully working with really good tools such as the one you see there, which is a grade level scale score table, but you don't need to have that at board meetings. If there are board members who are interested in being part of a curriculum committee or a school improvement planning committee, and that's the nature of your school that you would be involved, then that's the right place to look at it. But I strongly encourage you at school board meetings to stick to the highest level of data. And there are a number of reasons for that, not the least of which is how you want to present your information to the public, because that's always public information at the board meetings. So what else? Other than school level data, it is important to look at some groups. It's interesting to know what your baseline data is, the new students coming in. It's always good to look at what the data is for all students. And I would say the most important of all, and this goes back to your charter contract, what we call continuously enrolled students. Now those are the students by definition, by LSSU's definition, students that have been enrolled for 3 or more years. So an example of that, the first time a student's been enrolled for 3 years is at the end of grade 2. So how are the students who've been there for all of kindergarten, first grade, and second grade doing? Are they at grade level? And you could say the same thing right at the other end. At the end of high school, are they well prepared for college work and or life? So those are your continuously enrolled students, and you want to look at how they're doing. That's the impact of your school, your program on those students. And then finally, there are other subgroups that may or may not be of interest depending on your school composition. Special needs students, students who have English as a second language, economically disadvantaged. And now the Michigan Department of Education has put a lot of emphasis on something called the bottom 30%. I've got it in yellow there. I do want you to remember that. If you're not already familiar with how that's being used for accountability at the state level, I'd strongly encourage you to have a discussion with your administration and get some reports on it. It would take an entirely additional presentation that probably would have to go 90 minutes to fully understand the state's accountability system. So it's just a heads up. If you're not already aware of it or familiar with it, it's something you will want to learn about, and potentially if LSSU can offer you another webinar on it, that would be of interest. I think should be of interest. So moving right along, we're going to, as I mentioned at the beginning, you don't have to become experts, but there is a little bit of test speak that's important for board members to have in their toolkit. I've picked out these 4 things. I think you could probably pick out a few more, but reliability and reliability, norm versus criterion reference tests, test publishers information, and the achievement and growth concepts. So with that, let's jump right to the first one, which is reliability and validity. So hopefully this is all you need to know about it, and hopefully the pictures will help. Essentially, a test is reliable if you get similar information each time it is administered. However, there's a strong potential that what you're testing is not what you want to know, and then it's not valid. The other thing is you could be hitting the target every time, but you're doing it all over the place, and then it might be valid, but it's not reliable. What you want is a test that's both valid and reliable. And so valid is essentially, are you measuring what you intended to measure? The best example would be if what you want to measure is college readiness and you're giving primarily vocational type assessments that are, hands-on skills students need to succeed in a workplace directly upon graduation from high school. Those are 2 different things. You're not testing the right stuff. And the other piece is, as mentioned, reliability is your test getting similar results each time and it's administered? You don't need to, you're not going to be doing any of those tests of reliability or validity, but you want to ask that question. If you're looking at any assessments, do we know the test we're giving is both a valid measure of what we're trying to measure, and is it reliable? All right. No questions on that? We'll go to the next one. 2 basic types of tests that you can talk about, and there's more, and you could drill down in each one of these. But essentially, many of the tests you look at are what we call norm referenced. And that means the results that are reported to you are not how well exactly they did on the test, but how well students did on that test compared to other students. And usually it's something called a normed group. And for a little bit of explanation on that, essentially the big test publishers take all their results and then do a sample of students that match the general population in the United States, and that's called a norm group. And they take very large samples, and it is a good estimate of how your student taking the test in that school is doing similar to another student in another school in the United States. That's a normed group. And that's your NWEA or performance series, your explore, your plan, and then there's a test in the early grades called DIBELS that might be used in your school. And that has a normed reference reporting. The other type is a criterion reference. The best example of that outside of education that everybody's familiar with is the driving test. Essentially, if you've studied your driver's test manual as well as you possibly can, you can get a perfect score on a driving manual test, on a written driving test. That's because it's criterion reference. They want to know exactly what you know about the driving rules. So criterion reference tests, you can always get a perfect score, or you can get a 0 if you know absolutely nothing about the subject, because a criterion reference test is measuring specific skills and knowledge against what has been taught. The MEEP is an example of it. The future assessment that we'll hear a little more about, called the Smarter Balanced. The tests, the chapter end test, unit end tests, common assessments developed in a district or a school are criterion reference. And then just to give you an example, some tests can fall under both, depending on how they're reported. So DIBELS is actually developed to be a criterion reference test, but because it's so widely used, they've normed the results, and it can be reported out in both ways. All right, that's enough on norm and criterion reference, but I do want you to know those two terms. And I think what you've got here is enough on that. Carrying right on?
Mm-hmm.
I guess we can carry on to the next slide, but why would you want to know whether something is either criterion or norm referenced? Ask yourself that question, and I'll try and answer it as I go along.
Mm-hmm.
So these are just the examples of the ones that are used in all your schools. If you're up to 8th grade, you're given the Explore test, as well as either the NWEA MAP or the Performance Series test. And if you've got high school grades, you're given the plan and the ACT as well. Now, all of these tests are excellent assessments for what they're trying to do, which is generally measure both achievement at a given point in time and measure growth between 2 points in time. And the results that you always get back from these are relative to a normed group. You get national percentile rankings, you get SIP scores, so you get information relative to the norm group. You also do get scaled scores, but generally you won't look directly at the scale score, because if you see one, it won't mean anything to you. So these are good norm reference measures that are in your charter contract. These are the ones against which your students are being tested for both achievement and growth. The links that are in here are so that if you're interested in learning a little bit more about those, you can click on any one of those. And just so you know, I also gave the same information to your administrators in a webinar we did last week. All these test publishers now provide really good one-page summaries of their assessments, and they contain a lot of the information we've already talked about how they were normed, about whether they're criterion referenced or not. So if you're interested, feel free to check out those links. Now, what you've got here are the state assessments, the ones that are mandated. You've heard of them. MEEP test was just given last month. I put it in very small because there's a very good potential you'll never see it again. You're going to be getting your results in the new year, and you will look at those one more time. But coming up next year, the state is switching over to a test called the Smarter Balanced Assessment. And Michigan is one of approximately 30 states that will be given that assessment. I'll come back to that. You see I have that note there. MEEP has never been a valid or reliable measure of growth. So no matter what anyone tells you, don't look at MEEP tests over the past years to try and find how well students have been growing in your school. And I'll stand by that. I will, even though I'm not a psychometrician, I'll stand up next to any psychometrician or other person in the state who would suggest otherwise. And I think if you look at the literature, you'll see that is supported. MEEP test tells you how well your students are doing relative to the state-mandated standards. We used to call them grade level content expectations, and we're now moving to something called the Common Core State Standards. Enough said on the MEET, but I'd be happy to answer questions. I'm not giving you an anti-MEET message here or an anti-state test. Those are important measures, just as long as nobody ever should say that the MEET can be used to measure growth. Then there's the MME. I won't even go into great detail there. Let me get to the Smarter Balanced. The Smarter Balanced is the new test that's coming. It is Criterion Reference, and like the test you're already taking, the NWA and the Performance Series, it's computer adaptive. If you're not familiar with what that term means, the short version is, depending on how the student answers a question, the test either becomes more difficult or less difficult. So if they answer an item incorrectly, they get an easier item. If they answer an item correctly, they get a more difficult item in the next question. Again, if you're interested in that, I would strongly encourage your school leaders to do a session at your board meetings on explaining any one of these assessments.
Mark?
So they're piloting the Smarter Balanced Assessment? Yes.
Yeah, just if I could just interrupt for a second, because I'd like to hear from Nick to get his perspective on how the Common Core, the Smarter Balance, might have an impact on the charter contract relative to those educational goals.
Am I?
Yep, go ahead,
right,
Nick.
Angie. And that's it. After the first of the year, we're going to be sitting down and we're going to be reviewing those educational goals to make sure that they are in line with the new assessments that are going to be coming out. Because the goals that the way they are stated now naturally apply to the MEEP tests that have been given in the past. So we will be looking at it. And hopefully in the spring we'll be able to sit down with the boards and be able to present a new way of looking at the assessments for their educational goals.
Great. Thanks, Nick. Okay, Mark. Mark, are you there?
Hello.
Yep, go ahead.
I am here.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yep, sure can.
Good. So Smarter Balanced Assessments, they are coming. The Common Core State Standards, your schools have been working for 2 or 3 years aligning to those new standards. You probably heard a lot of discussion of those standards this past summer. We won't explore them tonight. Again, I hope you've had some great presentations from somewhere on those. A lot of information, and it's important, a big and important change in the public education sector to know about. Moving right along.
Mm-hmm.
So, achievement and growth. As I mentioned, both the NWA and the Performance Series and the Explore and the Plan are good at measuring both the achievement of your students, meaning how are they doing relative to other students on a common set of learning measures, both in English, math, science, and language reading. And they can measure well from point A to point B how well those students are growing. So it's really these norm reference assessments and all the work that's been done behind the scenes that make them good at measuring that. What's important is to measure both. In the past, there was a lot of discussion about growth being more important. And growth is very important. And the reason there was that discussion was that even in the further distant past, no one looked at growth. Everyone looked at snapshots in time from tests such as the MEEP test, and then compared those from one year to the next. And that's not an appropriate way to look for how well individual students are growing over time. These tests, like the ones we've discussed, Performance Series and NWA, because of the way in which the data is collected and reported, is very good at measuring growth. And so people started paying much more attention to growth. Unfortunately, what got lost was looking at achievement as well. And now, with new tools that are available, you can both look at growth and growth towards a standard. So you're looking at achievement as well as growth. Because if they're just growing, yet they're taking, for example, 1 step forward and 2 steps back, which happens with a lot of kids over the summer, they may never be getting to that achievement level that we expect of our students when they finish our programs. So let's move forward to the next slide. And what you should see is an old school view of, I think if you click again, that's how people used to look at MEP tests all the time. What percentage of students are proficient? And if you take a look at the red line at the bottom, that is an individual school. The blue line is a local district, and the green line is the state average. So often in the past, that school that was the red line, although it was trending very closely to the other comparators, it was seen as really not doing very well. If you took a look at just a growth measure on the bottom, that same school is in red. And compared to another group of similar schools, it's doing very well on growth. So, but again, one of the things with this, and I happen to know with this particular school, it wasn't getting students up to a level at which they would be successful at future levels of education. You know, if they were finishing at 8th grade, they weren't really prepared for high school because they'd never been prepared for a good rigorous curriculum. And similarly, if they're just tracking at high school, then they may not be ready for college or careers after high school. This other picture that's here is one of the unfortunate consequences when just achievement is looked at. You probably have all heard of No Child Left Behind, and the main measure under that was something called adequate yearly progress. And essentially, the MEP test was used for that measure, and the MEP test reported out at 4 performance levels, similar to those names that you see there, the below basic, basic, proficient, advanced. And schools found that they could make adequate yearly progress if they focused on what they called the bubble kids. And those are the kids in the circle. And that was good for that small group of kids, but it wasn't good for all kids. And that was an unintended consequence of a strong focus on achievement and defined as proficiency to a cut score. So, moving forward, that's old school stuff. I'm hopeful and confident that your schools aren't focused just on the bubble kids. LSSU uses a tool called Elevate 360, and it measures growth toward a standard. So what you see on the top image in this slide is a measurement of achievement. And that measurement of achievement shows that over time, students are getting closer to the target. So you actually see 3 years of data there. And what you see on the bottom slide, it's a similar measure, and it's measuring growth toward the target above. And you can see even higher levels of growth. So when your charter contract says your students are both it's expected that all students grow at a level that's adequate to get them to an achievement target after 3 years. That's what you see on the bottom graph. And the top graph shows how all students are doing relative to that target. One slice that I don't show you here, and that this tool can do for you, is measure how cohorts, for example, new students or students who've been enrolled 3 or more years, are doing relative to those targets. And that is another presentation that I know Nick will be providing to board members. Currently, only 6 schools, those that are in their midterm review this year, are using this, are piloting it with it. But then next year, as from what I've heard from Nick, the next set of schools going through what are called their midterm reviews will be analyzed using this tool. And that's called Elevate 360. The 6 school leaders that are currently using it have access to it and can share this information with you. They've had training on it and can get further support in how to read their data when it's put through this. The data that's put through this is what we talked about before, the performance series, the NWEA, the Explore, the Plan, and the ACT.
Nick, is there anything?
Good, valid, reliable measures of achievement and growth.
Sure. Nick, is there anything you'd like to add there?
No, Mark's correct. Last year we piloted Elevate 360. We were very pleased with the results that we saw, and we'll be adding 8 new schools this year to the Elevate 360 program because they'll be going through their mid-contract reviews next year. So I'll be contacting those school leaders to have them input and give them some directions as far as how they need to utilize the Elevate 360. But we found it to be a very valuable tool in being able to look at the performance of the students of the various academies.
Great. Thanks, Nick.
Some of you, hopefully some of the board members were in Sault Ste. Marie this past summer and saw me present on this topic as well. This is an illustration of how that tool analyzes achievement. It has a track which students, if they're on it, that means they are continuously, whether they're finished high school at the top end or whether they're in grade 2, you know whether they're on track to be college ready. And I know in grade 2, the reason this trajectory was developed was because everything we know about student learning is that when students get off track, that it's much more difficult to get them back on track. So the sooner you have the information to show you whether or not a student is achieving at a level, and from year to year, from spring to spring or from fall to spring, growing at a level that keeps them on track, the sooner you know that, the better. And if they're not on track, the sooner that you can put interventions in place to get them on track. Mm-hmm. We also know that students that are on track or above track tend to stay there. So it's not those ones that we're as worried about. Students can always fall off the track, but it's really important to have that information in your hands, and that's what that tool Elevate 360 presents to you. So just one more minute on this. What you see at the end is a 21. That's both the national average. If we can go back just for a second.
Oh, sure. Sorry.
The 21 is the national average of the ACT, and it's also a score which, if a student gets that at the end of high school, there's very good research that shows that that student will also be successful. If they get that as a minimum, they can be successful in first-year credit-bearing college courses. And we know that students that are successful at that level tend to stay and succeed in college. We also know that those skills are the same that students who choose not to go to college need to succeed in a 21st century workplace, something, our knowledge economy. The skills are very similar, and there's really good research to show that these college readiness, college entrance tests are helpful for all students, not just college-bound students, to understand where they are on that trajectory. The other blue dots you see are the other tests given at grade 8, 9, and 10, and that's based on long-term research, that trajectory. And then the red dots are those other tests we've already spoken about, NWA and performance series, and that is a backward mapping of the same idea of, are they on track towards getting that 21? All right, now the next slide. So this is a sample of what it looks like in your charter contract, the goals, the measures, the metrics, and the targets. All of you have language similar to this. Whether or not you're looking at Elevate 360, I'd strongly encourage you to ask of your school leadership to take your charter contract language and turn it into some sort of graph. The one I have on the right is one I created with a colleague that really is very simple. It's not sophisticated. There's no psychometrics. It's essentially putting the test scores into an Excel spreadsheet and then also putting the targets into the Excel spreadsheet and seeing how students are doing over the course of a year from fall, winter, and spring relative to those targets. So that's all that is, and hopefully someone in the organization, if they don't have Elevate 360, can do something similar to that so that you can see how you're doing relative to your charter contract. All right, and now your schools took the performance series test or the NWA test in the fall. I would say this is a great time to be asking for that baseline data for the school year. How did they do on their fall test compared to the targets in the charter contract? Now, you've been working with your school administration. You know what wise questions to ask when you're looking at the student data. You're getting great student information into your hands, and ideally is that next question, now what? In every school, there's always somewhere else to go. There's always improvement to be made. And the idea is that you don't just look at the data for the sake of looking at the data or for the sake of keeping Nick happy or the Michigan Department of Education happy or anyone else happy. The school leader and its staff in an ideal circumstance knew the data, knew the information as soon as it was put in their hands, and already have a plan on now what. What are we doing about our data, and how are we using the information to improve instruction? And there's ideally you've got that picture there illustrates a principal and his staff working after school or on a weekend with a data board. So if these practices aren't part of what's going on day in, day out in your school, ask why not. Even if you were one of the highest performing schools in either LSSU's portfolio or in your district, you still have somewhere to go. And the way to get there is to use the information you have.
Mark, just quickly, I would like to interrupt you. While you were talking about Elevate 360, we did have a question come in on the question pane. And the question reads, do the results transfer to other schools, and do you foresee this becoming a state level test, meaning E360?
No, I don't see E360 becoming a state level test. The Elevate 360 is an analysis of test results, and it is being used widely. It's being used by more than just like Superior State University. The Detroit Public Charter Schools office is using a similar analysis. Bay Mills Community College, 40+ charter schools use it. Ferris State's charter schools use it. CMU uses a variety of it. So there are, hundreds of schools now, well over 100 schools, 150 schools that are looking at the same analysis. The idea is that it should be made available to all schools. About a year and a half ago, there was something called the Mackinac Island Compact, and the Education Achievement Authority, the Detroit Public Schools, and all the authorizers agreed to look at student achievement through this lens. And more of them are going in that direction, but they're not there yet.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thanks, Mark.
I will add on to that, just before we do any more clicking. So the Smarter Balance, I'm going to, and we just stay on that slide, but the Smarter Balanced Assessment Consortium, this new test that's coming, will change the landscape in that it's a good test. It's a better test, I would say, than the MEET test in that it is computer adaptive. It also has aligned instruments that can be used at other times in the year. And I think what you'll find is an even greater emphasis and a better common measure of growth and achievement in the state. So, and Elevate 360 is test agnostic. So that idea of measuring growth and achievement using something like Elevate 360, Smarter Balance could be analyzed through that.
Mm-hmm.
All right, enough said on that. So the now what? Let's just go back to that now what question. And the last slide, I think. I'm going to give a shameless plug. I'm sure each of your schools has a number of tools that it uses to observe learning and to improve learning. One of the ones I've read about and seen in use at a number of schools I'm a big fan of. I make no commission on recommending this, but you might want to ask your school leadership, have you or are you doing what are called instructional rounds? You can see the book was written about 4 years ago, and it's really become widely adopted as a method of improving student achievement. And that's because instructional rounds get to something called the instructional core, really understanding the interaction between the teacher, the student, and the content. Without any more said, again, I would just leave it on your plates to ask if they don't have something as good or better as a method to observe student learning, you might want to suggest instructional rounds. There's my plug. All right, next slide. So, I think you've heard me say it many times, it's worth repeating, focus on your charter contract. That is the most important document in the life of a charter school. It defines your existence, and those contractual goals are important. Try and become somewhat familiar with test speak, because that allows you to ask wise questions. And then the most important wise question to ask is, now what? What are we going to do about this information that we've received from the student assessments? There's a couple of other suggestions there as well. Often allocating or reallocating resources to make sure that you can support the initiatives once the now what question is answered. And do try and make sure that that idea of academic achievement is an ongoing discussion. Mm-hmm. You've probably heard it from someone before. I know if you've had any interaction with the National Charter Schools Institute, you've heard of the 30-30-30 rule, meaning that at least 30 minutes of every board meeting is dedicated to discussing student achievement. And if it's not, what are you talking about? Mm-hmm. So again, get that on your agenda, talk about student achievement. If you came to my presentation in the summer, I gave you a calendar of something that you could discuss every month. There's always something interesting, exciting, and current to discuss on the topic of student achievement. So keep that on your agenda. And finally, question time.
Great. Thank you, Mark. And that concludes the formal presentation. So we're going to open it up for questions. So at this time, I would just ask that if you have a question, you raise your hand, and I will unmute you, and you can ask your question accordingly. Don't be shy. Well, we're waiting for questions. Nick, if there's anything you'd like to add in closing, that would be great.
Well, first I'd like to thank you and Mark for presenting this this evening. I hope the board members that did attend were able to get some valuable information from the topic, and hopefully you'll be able to ask the questions now of your administration to let you better understand how your students are performing at your academies. If ever any of the board members have any questions or they want something from the charter school office, please contact me through my email address. And as I said earlier, I would suggest that you go to the website and look at your contract for your charter, because I think it's very valuable that you know exactly what the expectations are of the academy that Lake Superior State University is putting out there for you to achieve. So again, I'd like to thank everyone for participating, and again, Mark and Angie for putting this on. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you, Nick. Liz, I see your hands up. I'm not sure if that was from your previous response or if you have an additional question.
No. I was wondering, I can't see a list of participants. Can you tell me if any other Way Academy Detroit board members are participating tonight?
Could you give me a few names, Liz, and I can certainly glance through for you.
Well, okay. Glenn Croxton, Croxton, Patrick Irwin, Irwin, familiar to you, but no. Pamela Wong, Wong, Michael Murray, Murray, Barbara Leroy, Leroy.
Yep, Pam is on the line. She was participating. Good. And that appears to be it. So yes, one other.
That's fine. We have a board meeting Monday, so I wanted to connect with them for a report.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And as I mentioned to all of you just before we close. Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Mark.
I was also just going to offer questions. If board members have questions they prefer to ask by email, I'm more than happy to answer them. And I'm also, I think it was mentioned that this presentation will be posted if
Right.
board members are interested.
Right, and that's what I was just going to remind them of, that it will be posted on LSSU's website, and we'll let you know when that's happening. It might be a few days just because we have to get formatting in order, and we want to just make it as perfect as possible. So we will let you know when it's out there, but thank you again for participating. And, you know, as Mark mentioned at the beginning of the session, we hope you certainly found value in the presentation and look forward to your feedback and comments. As you have them, please feel free to share them with Nick. And as Mark indicated as well, if you have additional follow-up questions, you can email either Mark, me, or Nick with those questions. So again, thank you for participating and have a super rest of your evening. And I am going to close the session now, so thank you again.